to the AA. It's my privilege and my pleasure to introduce Reinier de Graaf tonight for his talk. Please allow me the indulgence of introducing myself first. My name is Paul Crosby. I joined the AA just a few months ago as the head of professional practice, part 3. And normally, I think in most cases, the words part and 3 in the same sentence are enough to have most students and others running for the hills. One of the reasons why I do this job is because I'm really interested in professional practice, part 3, and the future, and maybe even the current, the contemporary practice of architecture. I think there is a change. I detect a change in the nature of practice, largely through the evidence of articles, books, periodicals, national press, debates, lectures, and so on, as exampled this evening. And I think it's becoming, we are in an interesting time of the development of the nature of practice and its relevance. And I think the word relevant seems to crop up a lot, both in terms of, gone are the days of the heroic modernist, the Howard Rorke's of this world, of the architect, the client, the fee, the project, the liability. Now the client might be the architect the client. There might not be a fee, projects are self-generated, and how we get into the process of designing buildings and projects is absolutely fascinating. It's also about thinking, architecture, and that's where I can now introduce Reinier de Graaf. I've always been fascinated by his books, his writings, his projects. And to give a little potted history, he joined OMA, as I think everybody here will know, in 1996. He's a director. 20 years ago, he's responsible for many projects, a list as long as my arm here, many of which are master plans, buildings, small projects, large projects, various typologies, and so on, several of which upset me a little bit because I came second on the teams of which OMA won. More importantly, perhaps for this evening's talk, the complex nature of a simple profession. Reinier de Graaf is a director of AMO, and is focusing on exhibitions, writings, and thinking. Recently published on the energy report, and having watched one of Reinier's talks recently, one of the TED Talks, been completely fascinated by the word prediction, the theme of prediction, and he said something really quite interesting in the middle of that talk in a slightly different way, and I think that's what we look to for Reinier de Graaf in his leadership of thinking in a slightly different way. So with no further ado, I'll hand over to Reinier de Graaf for the complex nature of a simple profession. Thank you very much.
Yes, so thank you, Paul, for this very charming introduction. Thanks also for crediting me for having written books. I've never written a book, but that's about to change, and in a weird way, that's what the talk tonight is about. The title of this lecture is actually the subtitle of a forthcoming book, the title of which I will disclose at the end. This is in a way the book in lecture form, and that immediately presents a very awkward problem, since the book is based on what I've been saying in lectures over the years. The book in lecture form is the lectures over the years, which everybody has seen, and it sort of defeats the purpose of the occasion, I guess. I've tried to work my way around this by making a synopsis that makes vaguely more sense than the sum of its parts. I also realized that I think it's about 2 years and 2 months ago that I last stood here with a lecture which was called The Risk of Realism, and I'm afraid that today the only thing I have to offer is even more realism. So let's see that as a form of antibiotic, more of the disease hopefully to cure the ail. Anyway, I'd like to start with this image. a photograph of Vkhutemas in the 1920s, the Soviet version of the Bauhaus. I was always fascinated by this image, I guess, partly because of the incredibly young age and considering the fact that in the 1920s probably looked older than they were. The people in this picture must be like, pre-puberty, nevertheless, and subjected to the lessons of Nikolai Ladovsky in a typical classroom setting in something that was called an exercise in space. Now, quite interestingly, invariably, the result apparently is a skyscraper of a lesson in space. I don't know what that means, but it's interesting anyway. The Vkhutemas was founded by Lenin as an effort to subject art and architectures to become the carriers of a social purpose, vehicles of a social purpose, and in a way, the expressions, appropriate expressions of the young republic, i.e. the Soviet Union. The Institute closed a couple of years later, I believe in 1928, under the reign of Stalin, who had different views, and there are many who argue that in a way the rewards of this whole creative outpouring have been reaped in other places than where they originated. This is a drawing from delirious New York, the city of the captive globe, which in a weird way articulates that very phenomena. The book also makes the point that in some way the capitalist US was the breeding ground, or the ground where ultimately the communist fantasies were realized, although, and there you have it again, in a slightly different way. The bargain, or the Faustian bargain, that these experiments actually paid for their re-emergence on the other side of the Atlantic was the fact that formally they survived, formally they were implemented on the condition that they traded in their ideological purpose. This is a grid, presumably the Manhattan grid, where on each plot, in a way, an architectural fantasy, an architecture which before that moment had totalizing pretensions, actually has to share the city with other views, and in a way has the liberty limited to its own plot to carry out that fantasy, and subsequently each plot, and those are literally the world, is potentially at war with the next plot, so therefore the total eruption of all these fantasies, of all these experiments, of all these ideologically, is the mutual cancellation of each other, like the products of a supermarket. It's very interesting. Modern architecture, many predicted that it wouldn't survive, but it has survived in an interesting way, although somewhere, something, somehow has changed. This is Ilya Golosov, Azov Workers' Club, Moscow, 1928. This is something similar in Cincinnati, and after nothing is personal. This is the Wolkenbügel in Moscow by Elisitsky. This is the Wolkenbügel in Rotterdam, a slightly shorter cantilever, probably because of budget reasons. This is l'unité d'habitation. This is l'unité d'habitation in white in Ispen, New York. This is Eisenman in Utrecht. And this is Rietveld in Cornwall, Connecticut. The Barcelona Pavilion, 1929, with its beautiful onyx walls, and I said nothing was personal, and to prove that, this is our own bus stop in Groningen, with a vastly reduced amount of onyx marble, also, as you can imagine, for budget reasons. This is interesting, because architecture changed, and presumably the picture, irrespective of the previous examples, that shows it most clearly is the following. This is the drawing with which Corbusier sort of patented the idea of a free architecture, reaping the rewards of the invention of reinforced concrete with the subject liberation of the plan libre, the façade libre, and all kinds of liberties pursuing in its wake. In a way, the drawing that patents the modern evolution that would follow in the 20th century. And this is in a way a live model of the same thing, only this time it is not an ideological statement. It is from a Greek website about real estate outlining the advantages of leaving a building unfinished because of the ample tax breaks you get. So it's almost one-to-one realization, of the former model, but this time purely as an agent of the financial system. What is that? Sorry. Modern architecture used to go hand in hand with a lot of rhetoric. I guess in our own limited way, we're trying to ensure that it still does. But on the whole, the days of those type of manifestos are over, in as much as there are manifestos today. It's often architects and architecture invoking extraneous causes to underpin their own legitimacy. Architecture is very rarely without an adjective anymore. We have green architecture, we have sustainable architecture, we have community architecture, we have the architecture of participation, etc. But strangely, the sum total of all those good intentions is weird. If this was the modern house in 1948, probably the most beautiful building of the 20th century, then the modern house of today looks something like this. And and awkward and extreme as that may sound, modernism is no longer something you see or you express in stylistic forms. Modernism is in a way a way of performing according to certain criteria, in this case 10, by which you measure, not perceive in any artistic sense, by which you measure modernity supposedly in any objective sense. And also here, the effect, I think, in many ways on real modernity has been corrosive. Let's look at one, community. The community used to be a prime topic, the source of a lot of debate in the later period of modern architecture. This is a meeting of Team 10, I believe in Aldo van Eyck's garden. The tree is, of course, off-center. There's a lot of women. They're either the wives or a lot of architects have simply failed to make it in the history book because of prejudiced history writers. But anyway, a revisionist modern movement who attempted in their own limited way to reform modern architecture, to become a sort of response in scale to the needs of users and the needs of the community. Often in a well-intended but somewhat naive sense. This is a book by Bakema. Can the lights be off? They should magically. I didn't touch anything. A contemporary of Van Eyck, a book in Dutch, Van stoel tot stad. It means from chair to city, which in a way depicts the built environment, the skyline of tall buildings and low buildings as that which reflects families with small, larger children and husband and wives, which in a way very somehow, in a vaguely patronizing way, engages with society, but of course in typical spirit of the time, society didn't allow itself to be treated like children. This is a very customary setting in the 1970s with residents actively getting involved in their own environment. A lot of sweat, a lot of cigarette smoke, a lot of beer bottles, but an active, lively debate, which we actually seldom see anymore. Strangely, the residents and participants today do allow themselves to be treated like children, with flip overs, boards, a kind of co-design, but ultimately only probably with the intention to make them complicit in the unavoidable, so they have no right to protest anymore once the monsters they live in are monsters of their own making. Community planning, I think the cover sort of says it all. Interestingly enough, this was a manifesto from Team 10, typed up, drawn up by the Smithsons, Habitat, making an argument similar to Bakema in a way of viewing the built environment as a range of scales which all deserved a similar degree of intention: the house, the street, the district, and the city. But of course, with all the intention for that stuff, what has happened over time is that same rhetoric is the rhetoric that, for instance, today features in the Charter of New Urbanism. A debate launched by modern, presumably leftist architect is now the domain of architects who are anything from leftists. And the same arguments for modern architecture have now become a kind of an argument for traditional rhetoric with an architecture with an almost indistinguishable rhetoric. This effect of neutralizing is interesting, a kind of a following comparison. A sailor off duty in the 1950s. We don't exactly know what he's going to do, but I can sort of suspect that this guy for the next couple of hours is going to have a lot of fun. Then we see this man, Truman Burbanks, and whatever we know is that in the next couple of hours, absolutely nothing unpredictable is going to happen to this guy. And strangely, it's not for no reason that movie, The Truman Show, was shot in seasides, the product of the new urbanists. Public space used to be the scene of politics, often violent politics, often turbulent politics. The Palace Square in St. Petersburg, 1915, that same Palace Square today. I mean, I guess I don't even need to talk with the images. Shopping, tourism are the standard product of formerly public space. Tiananmen Square, the Student Revolt in Beijing, and even that kind of has a very harmless, innocent appearance today. The Plaza de Revolución in Havana sort of falls victim to the ultimate tourist icon, which is the Pope. Strangely, the discovery of public space has meant a kiss of death, pretty much like the discovery of the community as a subject of discourse, has similarly endowed it with good intentions and stripped it of the message it was actually trying to convey. The Berlin Wall, a symbol of division, at some point a symbol of public space, which is in a way the moment, 1989, where probably the most significant of transformations in recent history began. The fall of the Berlin Wall, heralded by Francis Fukuyama, first in an essay entitled The End of History, and later in a book, 1991. Both coincided with the fall of the Soviet Union, where he in a way described anyway that the spirit of the current times simply doesn't need ideology anymore, that there is no more need for conflict, that all intellectual, ideological conflicts have been resolved, and that in a way Western liberal democracy has absorbed all of them in a kind of benign form of coexistence, pretty much like the Manhattan Grid absorbed all the architectures of previous eras in a kind of agnostic mode to agree to disagree. This is the world before 1991, a standoff between major blocs, the Western bloc, the Communist bloc, and a large non-aligned bloc. This was in a way the assumption of Fukuyama of what would happen over time. After 1991, he cleverly, of course, doesn't give a time scale, but I mean, this is more or less what it is, a world that is entirely blue, entirely electoral democracy. And it's also actually this world which has been at the core of the expansion of a lot of firms like ours, where in 1991, we were a kind of a studio operating from Rotterdam. I think when I came 20 years ago, we were 35 people and happily on the verge of bankruptcy, continuously. Meanwhile, we have multiple offices. I wouldn't go as far to say that we're rich, but I mean, a global presence has ensured some sound financial continuity. And we also have projects all over the world with the latent assumption that irrespective of cultural differences, which of course we know exists, we could essentially operate globally without prejudice, and we could operate globally with the principles that we hold high. Of the apotheosis of that was, of course, the realization of China Central Television building in Beijing, which came into the office in 2002, and as an illustration of the kind of presumed homogeneity of the global condition, that was a decision, a management decision at the time, whether we took part in the reconstruction of the World Trade Center after 9/11 or whether we worked in China. And I remember, of course, the decision was ideologically charged, but it was so ideologically charged on either side that ceased to be interesting, and we took the decision on a very pragmatic basis that we suspected China's got the Olympics, they'll probably build a building, Americans are Americans, this is so stressed, this is under such a magnifying glass that it'll probably become a decade-long talk show, and there's not much to be gotten for us. So a very pragmatic decision, and an ultimate simple desire to build our buildings, which underlay the decision to go for the right and not for the left. They're both about the same size, by the way, as well. So that was that world, but I mean, 25 years, or actually more this year, after the Soviet Union collapsed, after the publication of Fukuyama's book, we find a very different world. We have projects still in the same trenches, still in the same locations globally, but to say that we can act with any homogeneous intention or any homogeneous way of working is a folly. The world today looks like this. The projects are still there, but we have to reach a point where the difference in systems has to be recognized, even exploited. I've explained these categories many, many times ad nauseum. It's a very simplistic reading of the world, admittedly, but probably no less true. In blue you have elections, in red you don't have elections, in yellow you have elections, but you know in advance who's going to win. A marvelous source of stability and predictability and good for business, probably not good for a lot of other things. It in a way also means your projects don't meet with universal approval or praise. A couple of examples. This is a project in the glorious Republic of Kazakhstan, where we proposed a science city in a beautiful landscape close to the Chinese border, a number of clusters for scientific experimentations, founded by a private client, of course inspired on structures developed in former Soviet architecture. But I mean, Kazakhstan meanwhile had different views on architecture. They got rich, that means they developed bad taste and a preference for Libeskind. That sort of, I guess, meant the end of our nostalgia, but we got another chance to build a science city not that much later on the outskirts of Russia, in a way a recycling on a larger scale of some of the similar idea, where things looked very good for a long time, that we might be building the whole thing, presented them to the highest political levels, but even in a pseudo-democracy, political levels and preferences change. So today that would have looked like that. In a way, that was not to be that. There's another aspect about this system and the three systems as we aligned. If you look at money concretely, and if you look at money at the disposal of governments, and for instance, you look at the size of sovereign wealth funds of nation, that is money that national governments have directly at their disposal to invest in things, in projects, infrastructure, and all sorts of political ambition. That is not money They don't have to go through the private sector to persuade them to act according to their policies. It's money they can directly spend on their policies. I mean, Norway is the only democratic country up there, but if you do the sums, you reach a very interesting phenomena. I mean, it used to be, and that's part of Fukuyama's message, that democracy was a ticket to prosperity. That if you became democratic, that it would only be a matter of time before you would become wealthy, and that the desire to become wealthy was ultimately the reason for a lot of countries to embrace democracy, a political idea largely embraced for economic reasons, which means that as soon as that logic begins to fail and other systems begin to outperform democratic systems in a system of the global economy, a very worrying situation arises. To illustrate, this is Dubai in 1990, Sheikh Zayed Road with a workers' housing complex, which is mean that's that same road. In the lower right corner, you see a tidbit of that workers' housing complex, dwarfed by the eruption of, well, I guess we can call it modernity, right? Patrick? Yeah. Okay. Well, let's say then dwarfed by the outburst of real estate buildings or whatever. The interesting thing is that this is a picture of an established city on the global stage in which probably nothing is older than 15 years. A city which at the turn of the century was a smuggler's haven for Iranian smugglers, struck oil wealth in the 1970s, used that oil wealth to invest massively in the country's infrastructure, even in planning. This is an early urban plan made in 1993, so more or less at the time of the first image, for the development of the whole emirate, practically targeting the entire territory of the emirate by an Australian firm called Parsons. That plan was implemented, but only a few years later, out of date, massive traffic jams, and the growth outperformed the planning. The Australian engineers were gathered to the table, again, roll up their sleeves and in a quite a hurried fashion, come up with alternative scenarios to in a way meet the needs as they were then. They drew a new plan, which was actually 10 years. The first plan was supposed to have been valid for 10 years. The second plan, for 20 years. The second plan was in place only 10 years after the first, was supposed to last another 20 years. But the weird irony is that by and large, the plan they drew is actually a tracing of the aerial map as the situation had already developed on the ground. It's only very partially true, because whenever Dubai presents itself, about half of what you see doesn't exist yet, but it's put out there on billboards, in advertisements so often and so frequently that it in a way overrides your view of reality. I mean, people, you see the cinemas a hell of a lot more than you fly over it by plane, when its plane is hazy anyway. So it's a future announced reality which has taken the place of a current reality. And that reality is in a way a tapestry of individual urban fragments, a lot of them not there yet, but those fragments play in a way the same role. They announce a future reality, happily competing with each other over the population they're trying to attract. You have a massive real estate development in an emirate with virtually no indigenous population. 85% is aspect. In a normal situation, in a normal modern context, your building was a response to a need. Here, building is largely a means to create a need. Any urban plan is an announcement, a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy that has to attract the very population it builds for, and therefore can only hope to make itself happen. That, of course, is a situation of enhanced competition, as you can see, not of buildings, but of urban plans. So in a very weird way, the same illustration from 1972, what that did to architecture, in a way, Dubai does to urbanism. It cancels out not only totalizing views of buildings, but it also cancels out any global validity of an approach to urbanism, of urban plans. Like buildings, urban plans become a product of multiple choice, very deliberate multiple choice, because that multiple choice, by and large, is a smokescreen, an essentially authoritarianly ruled nation needs to throw up in order to operate on a global stage. This is how it works. Whoever visited Dubai knows the very many billboards with property developers with all sorts of weird names, literal, etc. But in a seeming landscape of free enterprise, free competitions, and also a very varied urban landscape. Once you go under the surface and you do a little bit of research, you find that these hundreds of property developers are actually owned by three holdings. They have a 51% share in those little enterprises. Those holdings, in turn, are 51% owned by the ruling family. So therefore, what in business terms is a monopoly presents itself as a landscape of free enterprise, as a perfectly almost Western situation of entrepreneurial chaos, but which in fact is a very carefully orchestrated situation by one family and probably one man. Dubai has an institutional and governmental infrastructure. I guess a diagram like this doesn't look that different from a diagram that indicates, let's say, the way the Netherlands or London is governed. But of course, it's how the diagram is populated. To the right, to the left is the public sector, to the left is the private sector. And it is not because of local dress that people on either side look the same, it's because they are the same. Where in a way, even somebody like Donald Trump has to relinquish, his business interest in order to assume public office. Here, business interests are a prerequisite to enter public office. A number of examples that the chairman of the executive councils is the chief of a large property developer, as is the CEO of the one who leads the Department of Economic Development, the port, a public entity. They're all in a way run by chairman of property developers, which de facto creates an interesting and very productive and opportunistic ambiguity. Are you looking at a state on the global stage with all the restrictions states have to interfere, or are you essentially looking at a business? And all the discussions about Emirates, the state subsidies, whether it's fair competition to an airline like British Airways or KLM, of course, are deeply rooted in this ambiguity. And the ambiguity, at least in property development terms, is phenomenally successful. This is a map of the world which shows the six largest property developer from the United Arab Emirates and where they are active. They are essentially active from Morocco all the way to the Philippines, in the part of the world where the city growth largest, also the part of the world most neglected by actually Western discourse and our own discourse. So, to illustrate what that looks like, this is a cityscape at Abu Dhabi, the type of modern architecture that is produced there. I mean, metaphors don't even cover what you see, which I guess is interesting. But there's another interesting thing. This is, we all know who this is. With his turning torso, Pritzker Prize winning, very renowned, probably very expensive architect. This is Cityscape Dubai with the same thing, a little different, is done probably in a tenth of the time for a tenth of the budget with a tenth of the prima donna-ism that undoubtedly accompany something like this. And this is the skyline that in a way ensues in the wake of that. This is a skyline with skyscrapers, and think of the first image of the pupils of Ladovsky, where, you know, the prime experiment in space is a skyscraper. We see a lot of evidence of that a century later. But all these skyscrapers are done by either unknown architects or by engineering firms who also have an architect and they make damn sure that he's not known, etc. But by all the nobodies, and this is the same skyline, by all the somebodies, by all the, you know, highly rewarded architects in the world. Again, nothing personal, I must stress, but you can sort of wonder, I mean, how much of a difference really is there? And considering the fact that's us right there in the middle, but you almost need to draw a red line around it to sort of appreciate the iconic value that was invested in the building, because once juxtaposed to everybody else's iconic investments, it sort of fades away. We assumed that the financial crisis of 2008, which clearly hit the Dubai pretty hard, would in a way create a clean slate where, you know, a dark looming sky would in a way allow us a new beginning. And in the new beginning, we reveled. This was our new beginning. A building, well, yeah, 200 meters wide, 300 meters high, 20 meters deep. I think that about suffices to a building that can be described according to its dimensions. Massively present from one side, very slender from the other side, to again be massively present from the other, so also formally very varied. A facade with, you know, a few exceptions there, also elevated repetitiveness and boredom to the status of an aesthetical ideal. But of course, a building that was very much designed for its context. In a way, you can view the plan that the building was supposed to be in the middle of as the apotheosis of that imaginary skyline of the last couple of slides, which means that the effect of our building is that when everything is exuberant, something that is deliberately not exuberant becomes exuberant, and in a way weirdly indicates the full cycle which architecture has come to in its drive for extravagance. So when we had discovered that, we were very happy. I mean, it presented a future for our business where, in a way, you know, effect and investment could be aligned again in a plausible way. So we designed stamps of the Emirate where they promoted themselves through our building, an advertisement in a Korean newspaper as a form of script, and in a way somehow elevated it at that point in time to the status of an ideological statement. But that sword, of course, is doubly edged, because the sword only remains valid as long as everybody else decides to do something very, very differently. And of course, the sword is also doubly edged because it's a déjà vu. This is, it's a bit of a segue, but this is the Holiday in Beirut, building, I believe, from the late 70s, a building that throughout its existence, most of its existence, has remained unoccupied, a beacon in the middle of Beirut's civil war. Since a hotel room, a very high hotel building with a lot of rooms, offers snipers the perfect opportunity to operate from. It's the factor that decides the dominance in a civil war. So this building was fought over room by room, square meter by square meter. There's a Palestinian fighter in front of a photograph of Nasser. And today, of course, Beirut has moved on, but the building hasn't. It's stayed empty as a weird statement, almost as exceptional as the statement we tried to make in Dubai, but also a testimony to its utter unusability and perhaps unviability. Across the road, another building is going up, and strangely a building about the same size, about the same number of square meters as the hotel. The hotel stays empty, but other new buildings of a similar size go up. And perhaps that is the essential difference between modern architecture and modern architecture. That one, even though it looks the same, even though it has all 90-degree angles, even though it has concrete, even though it is wide, even though the formal language of the building is identical to its, in a way, its earlier incarnation, that the role it plays in the system is fundamentally different and antithetical to modern buildings in the 20th century. The efficiency of means of buildings used to serve the purpose that buildings were cheap. They were cheap to buy, they were cheap to rent, and they, in a way, facilitated the distribution of space along masses, along those who needed it. When a building, a modern building, is rational, it uses the economy of means, it serves a profit margin rather than a distributability. I mean, the beautiful building, admittedly very nice building by Herzog and Domeron, in the local context of Beirut, is a source of real controversy. The good intentions of supposedly enlightened, well-respected modern architects are actually met with protest and met as part of a trend of gentrification, global gentrification of cities, which pushes out a lot of the local people. And whether it's in Beirut, whether it's in New York, or whether it's in other architects in similar time in China, of course, what you encounter because of that also today is that modern architecture becomes the object of protest for that very reason, because it has become an agent of inequality of sorts. Modern architecture today, I mean, this is Xi Jinping in his famous speech that nobody knows existed. There's no transcript of it. It's even uncertain if he made it at a literary symposium. Architecture should be like the sunshine from the blues and the breeze in spring that will inspire minds, warm heart, cultivate taste, and clean up undesirable work styles. I mean, I guess the venom is in the end. Now, this is literature, but of course the message was very well understood by those implementing policies. But strangely, this was an objection against outside influence in China, against Western modernism in China, which was in a way an agent antithetical to the principles of what still is a communist party, reminiscent of the way Khrushchev, in a way, presented with similar language, slightly more Russian, I guess, in its directness, against the wasteful architecture promoted by his predecessor, Stalin. So there is a very weird thing, and there's a very weird way that modern architecture, the architecture we all claim to profess still, the architecture we've all been educated to like because it is emancipatory, it is social, actually meanwhile is an agent of opposite forces. This is a book, it's an economic analysis of inequality over a very long period of time, written by Thomas Piketty. And the interesting thing is, once you look at this analysis, it actually casts an interesting light on some of the curious historic developments in architecture as well. I mean, to put it very simply, he has analyzed over a long time the behavior of capital. I mean, the return on capital compared to the return on labor. How much money do you make by working? How much money do you make by having money? And as soon as you make more money by having money than you do by working, of course, inequality grows larger. When that's not the case, it grows smaller. For a long period in history, actually, interestingly, only the 20th century formed a brief exception, I never knew this, where the income on labor was higher than the return from capital. A period where one, in a way, eclipsed the other, turns out to also be the period of the most prolific production of utopias, social utopias, in architecture. This is the first thing. And the strange thing is that when you analyze it very, very closely, and the whole pattern of the book very closely, is that it sort of follows the development of the system. By the early 1970s, modern architecture had become unpopular. There's the infamous demolition of the Pruitt-Igoe estate, which in a way shook the confidence of modern architecture and modern urbanism as a global panacea. That wasn't the end of manifestos, but the manifestos became pensive, became reflective, became more introspective, and in a weird way complement the cycle. But on the whole, the production of real architectural manifestos seems to coincide with that period. The short 20th century, 1914 to 1989, as Hobson describes the century. It's very interesting. The most prominent architectural manifesto of 1914 was probably the Futurist manifesto by Marinetti, celebrating the drastic and often violent upheavals of modernization as a source of progress. The most, well, I can't call it the most important, but I guess the most talked about book on architecture of 1989 was A Vision of Britain by Prince Charles, which I guess, in a way, says it all. I mean, when that is the conclusive chapter of an epoch, the epoch may as well not have happened. And if you think that's an exaggeration, look at what we're doing to the physical substance of that epoch. Pruitt-Igoe wasn't the only one. It was the first in a long list. Minguet, Lyon, recently demolished. Here in England, in Sheffield, Norfolk Park Estate, Royal Taylor Park, Chicago. In America, the trend continues. Dermot Tower in Dublin. I mean, if you think destruction is architecture, I mean, it's a sort of age where you can eat your heart out. The Villa di Scampa in Naples was in 2003. Ravel the Presov in Paris, 2004. Another in Lyon, 2005. Nantes. Churchill House in Belfast. Sheriff's Corridor, Glasgow, 2003 since 2000. Lyon, 10. Vitry-sur 2010. Another Glasgow building, 2014. FA Tower in Frankfurt, all gone. So that's gone. Good riddance. But then it begs the question, what do you do? We know before we had feudalism, what will we have after? Apparently our track record to deal with the city, with large-scale solutions, to, in a way, cast a desire for social mobility in concrete is gone. But luckily others are taking our place. The smart city is a very important discussion at the moment. It's actually all sorts of people talking about the city, which I didn't know had any expertise on the city, but that doesn't prevent them from talking about it quite a lot. It's the tech sector, which through the digital revolution, in a way, hope to retrofit cities in such a way they become functional. I mean, they're the ones writing manifestos, mostly, at the moment, often with the same kind of hubris and the same kind of optimistic redemption as modern architecture manifestos, I guess, once were written, probably with the same naivete. If you look at a number of them, this is how they deal with the city: Siemens, Cisco, and IBM. Essentially offering a whole load of services for the city: social service, public safety, healthcare, energy. This is Cisco. Again, smart building, smart public service, integration, mobility. Siemens, transport, public administration, security, healthcare. What is interesting is that jointly, these tech companies combined seem to offer the whole menu of what previously were considered public tasks under the public administration, under democratic control, presided over by elected officials, are now increasingly supposedly provided in a more competent, more effective manner by private companies. So you can wonder whether the whole smart city rhetoric isn't a veil for a massive privatization with a clear business perspective of its advocates. If you look on a global scale, a very interesting scale confusion has been produced by globalization. In red is countries, ranked in terms of size. In the middle is cities ranked in terms of size. On the right is corporations in terms of size. Once you eliminate all categories and you leave size as the only source of ranking, a very strange kind of shuffled card deck emerges, where Walmart is larger than Norway, BP is large of Greece, and I think this was even before the shit hit the fan, where a company like IBM is larger than Sri Lanka, Cisco is larger than Lebanon, Microsoft is larger than Croatia, up to the point, and this is probably an even more drastic privatization proposal than Hyde Park, you could regard the world, or at least compare the world, to an archipelago of players, at least of a size and significance to that of countries. Of course, when corporations grow and they become transnational, they become ever less loyal to their place of origin. I think that's an almost inevitable law, and you see this. I mean, tax issues arise everywhere. Amazon faces European Union tax avoidance. Pretty sure to stop Starbucks from dodging taxes, it won't work. And this one's priceless. Google chairman Eric Schmidt, defense tax judge, it's called capitalism. And that, in a way, I guess says it all. If the world, in Fukuyama terms, pre-1991, some loyalty of corporations to the nation, essentially still the force which guards political interests, the situation after 91 is a kind of ménage à trois, where the loyalty has shifted to a global stage where there isn't an overriding political system in place to keep corporations in checks, which means that in a final instance, the political and nations, like buildings and urban plans before them, have become a similar matter of multiple choice as a result of the same system. At the end of history that Fukuyama predicted, therefore, where blocks would be replaced by a single democratic unity, probably is more closely to the whole world being presided over by a single pseudo-democratic, where you never know whether it's business interest, political, when it all becomes a single, inextricable, undisentangable moral universe, where we can point the finger every much as like at this as non-democratic, but where imminently, if the iconography is anything to go by, there is only the pot calling the kettle black in the whole world. I mean, I wanted to end on probably a little bit less grotesque note than the ones I've been talking about so far. I wanted to end on Germany. The fall of the Berlin Wall, the 25-year fall of the Berlin Wall was celebrated in 2014, and in many ways Germany itself is an interesting place to take stock of what that has actually brought us. I wanted to talk about a place called Marzahn. Marzahn used to be a small town on the east side of Berlin, which up until 1972 looked like the 18th century was not over, a happy town in East Germany. But it became subject of one of the largest Großsiedlungen, one of the largest urban expansions, or probably the largest urban expansion in the history of the world. Some 230,000 units built in an incredibly short time, where you see a horse and carriage, little peasant houses, and massive kind of prefabricated units around. A thing that addressed the East German housing crisis very effectively through an integration of the industry and an enormous speed initiated by Khrushchev. What we regard as a typically Eastern European phenomenon, but actually this picture isn't Marzahn, it's actually Gropiusstadt, which becomes apparent once you show it in color, which means that for a long time, despite the incredible ideological opposites between systems on either side of the fence, the physical appearance and somehow the basic ambitions were remarkably similar. I mean, I've done tests outside of, or even in Germany, with a series of slides of West and East Berlin from before the fall of the wall. And even Germans have a hard time pointing out which is which. But then the wall fell. And since then, strangely, in a united Germany, in a single country, the asymmetry has increased. The similarity on either side of an ideological opposite has given way to a vast asymmetry in the context of a supposed ideological consensus. Demographics, people fleeing the country, disposable income, massive difference, unemployment rate inversely proportional, of course, and this exodus typically hits a place like Marseille in an incredibly serious way. Germany has an aging population. East Germany, on top of that, has a departing populations, which means schools are increasingly empty, demolished. The former rapidly constructed prefabricated houses are now demolished, or rather disassembled. I mean, the advantage of prefabrication is that it allows easy demolition, where in a way the spare parts are sized up by a new type of contractor, assembled, refitted, and in a way applied in small, beautiful Swiss-like holiday homes such as this one, clouded in a layer of puts. But this house somewhere near Brandenburg, in the Blumenviertel, actually one wouldn't know it, but it has absorbed the entire history of the 20th century. It has the Russian Revolution, it has Khrushchev major change, it has the most impressive building industrialization effort of former East Germany the world has ever known. It has its demolition, and it has puts. So it, in a way, it absorbs unwittingly all of history. And it does so by, in a way, simply pretending that 1900 is still there. It has absorbed history by making it vanish. I've written a lot about this quarter in rather more nuanced terms than I'm explaining now. But I mean, I guess this is what architecture always was to many people: four walls and a roof, which is also the title of the forthcoming book. Thank you very much. Somebody asked me if I take questions, which I do.
My name is Paula. I used to be an OMA colleague. I would like to ask, are we walking to a more sober, aesthetical type of architecture? Is there one type, or is it not the infinite types that we're walking to?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I have to say, of course, my talk is hardly propositional. That may be apparent. What my talk tries to do is that the root cause of certain things is far deeper than the notion of any stylistic change. The reason why I've showed the Holiday Inn in Beirut immediately after our own supposed self-indulgent triumph of a year before is also to aggressively show the limitations of that approach. Even the most radical formal shift doesn't fundamentally address the problem that the role of architecture in the current system is almost fundamentally different by definition, and almost impossible for architects to change themselves unless they become active agents in the system that provides the context for what they do. So one of the things I would advertise is a kind of moratorium on style for a while, and then, simply looking around long enough to arrive at a kind of reset where some pretty unexpected things may be necessary. So, in short, I don't know.
The captive globe. Sorry to go back to that.
Nobody told me you'd be here.
When that was done, it was sort of like 40 years ago or more. An optimistic message. It was like the grid allows all the ideologies to coexist together on a grid. And now it has become all the different factions warring with each other. Is that to do with the state of the world in 40 years has changed into warring sections?
Well, I mean, the thing is that each island potentially at war with the next is actually a quote from the book. So that's not my invention. That was rhetoric that accommodated, a very warning rhetoric that accommodated the image even 40 years ago. And I think in a lot of the things in Delirious New York, as did the work of Archiegram, as did the work of Super Studio at the same time. It's both optimistic and pessimistic. Even its optimistic celebration of phenomena that are recognized also contains an acute warning. And of course, the 1970s were probably a time to, in the context of the overall pessimism, Pruitt-Igoe was 1972, the same year as the drawing, was of course gave ample reason to highlight the optimism. I think the present gives ample reason to highlight the aspect of the warning, which I think was already present even 40, or even explicitly stated 40 years ago. So I'm not reinventing anything.
No, but it's more the ideologies that were at war, but not the not the architecture. Now, in a strange way, architects are at war with each other because they're always striving for the same job.
Yeah, but I think that the key thing there is the grid, and the grid, yeah.
Competition and not joining in sort of a new ideology.
But I think that there was even because the drawing is, it projects difference and it projects cohesion at the same time, and the cohesion in the form of the grid allows the differences to exist. But if you look at Dubai, even the grid, which is the one thing you could agree on, even if you disagreed on everything else, in the current moment, even that is absorbed in a situation of multiple choice. So, you play a game, but you play the game according to certain rules, but the descent transcends to ever larger territories. It's a descent about architecture, consensus about urbanism. Then it becomes dissensus about urbanism. Then it becomes consensus about the political, which produces different forms of urbanism. And then there's dissensus about the political at large. And I think the whole, probably it's a last level of cohesion that guarantees a happy ending towards war, and that with that level of cohesion fading, even that happy ending is by no means guaranteed. I mean, that's at least how I view it.
Okay. Well, thanks for so stimulating.
Yeah, can.
Well, thanks a lot for the talk. I think you raised a lot of interesting puzzles, paradoxes, and challenges. And I think I just want to challenge you. You said you're non-propositional, and I wonder how long you will sustain that posture. But you're only implicitly taking positions. So I just wonder, I want to challenge you whether you are an anti-capitalist, whether you are nostalgic for the modernism and reject the new diversity which depicts itself and variety in the skyline like Dubai. And I also wanted to pick up some of the strands where you were challenging, you said there was a corruption of the concept of community. Are you really saying that what Team 10 stood for had more validity and more substance than the contemporary participatory structures? You showed that image and ridiculed that. Or public space, you're really looking for kind of big demonstrations. I mean, at the same time, they're still happening in various third world countries. So just wanted to make one more point and challenge you on that diagram where you started talking about we've lost the ability to talk about architecture without qualifying adjective. and there is a series of criteria and concerns which we need to address: green architecture, sustainable architecture, community architecture, participatory architecture. But what is that architecture stripped bare of these qualifications? I have an answer, but what I would say, I wanted to ask you directly.
But what's the question? Okay, my position. I vote left wing. I always have done. But I don't think that is primarily the issue. What I am targeting is a certain amount of myopicism, I don't know what the English word is, where good intentions, particularly good intentions, become susceptible to huge abuse. And it's not that Team 10 is better or worse than any of the current participatory movement. The alarming fact is that the same language can be used by either side to further their cause. Presumably both are wonderful people, both have good intentions, but they are opposite sides of the political spectrum. And the rhetoric doesn't betray them. And when the rhetoric and the whole discourse is apparently so interchangeable between one end of the spectrum and the other end of the spectrum, that I think calls for a certain amount of concern and calls for a kind of a step back to really perceive differences in what is going on. And I'm more in the business anyway, of exposing the hypocrisy of others than too obviously revealing my own. Although I'm sure a certain amount of hypocrisy is necessary to make any system function, but that's maybe an entirely new lecture, and probably best not given by me. But the implicit position is, and that's also in the title, the implicit position is a position against the myopicness of architecture in whatever form. And I'm all for diversity, but I think the whole situation is also a lot less diverse than physical appearances would suggest, and that there is in fact a lot more homogeneity than one might think underneath it all.
The microphone is fixed if anyone wants to ask a question.
Anybody under the age of...
I guess I read it, I think, in a book weirdly about metabolists quite some time ago, and I think it was actually even Ram saying it, that in order to create an avant-garde movement or any movement with a very strong formal language, very strong propositions, it requires a government or any sort of condition which would be very strong in order to either oppose it, to react to it, or have a strong support in order to realize your ideas. And now, if I understood correctly, this condition is sort of lost because of constant, increase of homogeneity of the world. And do you think it's necessary to kind of frame what you just spoke about in some sort of language, which would allow people to, to position themselves, in accordance with it, another, to kind of frame the current situation as this, strong force, which can be either opposed or agreed with, or it should rather keep on going, as it is right now. So what sort of
I think that there is, of course, and many architects have this, somewhat of a bizarre fascination for authoritarian regimes, for strong, let me say for strong states, for states which can contemplate ambitions on a scale that any visionary movement would like to see them realized. More than once, and very often, those states are not democratic, or at least more authoritarian than you would like to be. So there is again a very different, I think the visionary has a very difficult relation to democracy in the Fukuyama sense, that any form of radical politics or any form of radical aesthetics needs a form of radical politics and vice versa. That is why Marzahn and the whole Eastern, it's in a way also an expression of that. The market economy, which is about competition, which is about privatization, almost has to manifest itself to diversity to keep that system going. And of course, cohesion, being consequent, taking visions to their ultimate conclusion, is very deeply embedded in the ethos of architecture, which was in a way why the drawing, The Captive Globe, was perceived with a certain amount of shock when it was actually produced by the prevailing architectural elite at the time, because it simply surrendered the whole thing in a kind of laissez-faire. But I don't know, because we got this question a lot when we worked on the energy grid for Europe that you mentioned in your introduction, that the only way to make this happen would be a superstate. While it was actually a system that we were proposing, there was a kind of coordinated use of diversities within Europe to create a mutually, I'm assuming the project is somewhat known, mutually complementary situation. And here I think it is again the presence of a system that allows cohesion, but at the same time allows everybody to play its part. I think that's true modernity. I think the current unpopularity of the European Union is a very unfortunate thing, because it is precisely an attempt at being that system that allows a number of fiendishly different nations to be more than the sum of their parts. But because it can never play the role of an archetypal hero or of a leader, it is almost by definition unpopular. And it's very weirdly shocking at how popular authoritarianism, or at least authoritarian postures, are at the time, because in a weird way they're also unmodern. I think if there is a larger scale, it is the result of overriding systems that synchronize things in a more subtle way like that than in the presence of a superstate per se.
About some 10 years ago or so, I saw your reaction to the assassination of Theo van Gogh on the streets of Amsterdam. It was a very personal...
You saw my reaction?
Yes. Very personal reaction to an act of fanatic extremism. And today you outlined a more formal reaction to the sort of condition of the quasi-democracy, as you call it. You've explained enough about what puts you off or what you're reacting against. My question is, what are the conditions that stimulate and inspire you the most?
Wow. It's the link with my personal reaction to Theo van Gogh's death I hadn't quite made in the preparation of this lecture, so forgive me if I struggle a little bit of that. What kind of inspires me is our weird forms of anarchy, where things aren't quite what they seem. What inspires me is that situations, once people think they got through the bottom of things and they've conquered the whole truth, that there turns out to be a kind of jenseits, a larger picture to that truth, which unsettles that truth in favor of a kind of new doubt, which is also why I myself hesitate to be propositional beyond projects, because I mean, projects I invariably see as limited editions with a life before, a life after, and a neighbor who, probably wants to be at war with this. But that is what inspires me is a kind of curiosity and a kind of perverted pleasure in seeing preconceptions kind of tumble. What inspires me is ridiculing the smart city, green architecture, which by no means means that I'm against the whole idea of sustainability, which by no means means that I'm in favor of pollution, etc. But I mean, it's the revenge of the ever-returning complexity onto simplicity that is the main source of inspiration. I don't know whether that makes any sense, but...
Let me have another go at this very simple question. When you showed this Dubai image and you're bleaching out that kind of self-defeating competition of icons, where complexity eats itself up into visual chaos. I mean, I agree with that as a critique, but I'm worried about what the juxtaposition that is becomes that reverting back to a simplicity which was dynamited, and you showed a beautiful example of how this these models have been defeated and they continue to be defeated. And then I think when we look at recent work, you have the science cities you showed, which seem to be a kind of neo-Hilbersteinian modernism as well, or yeah, a lot of recent projects which go for that kind of generic simplicity concept. What does it really mean? Is that just a juxtaposition of an ironic stance, or is it really a model?
No, I think it is very important that the modernism we propose for Dubai is not a general statement, is not a general modernism we advocate. It's a highly contextual statement that probably in its extremity only works in that context, which embodies the opposite extreme. We have, to some extent, experimented, because it's partially a response to Dubai, it's also partially the response to a context of a certain mentality in architecture, which strives towards the unique, et cetera, et cetera. And we have applied it beyond that building, only to increasingly abandon it as well, because a more subtle context calls for a more subtle response. And I think there's very little general formalistic approaches in our office that survive for a very long time anyway. I think boredom with ourselves is a very potent source of inspiration to keep on producing. So it's not a general statement. It's not that from now on, you know, all buildings should be boxes. But let's say it's a contextual, it's a calculated contextual intervention, as most our projects are.
Going back to what you were saying about this globalized corporate world we now live in this,
Do you have another bottle of water?
A homogeneous corporate world, how would you describe, or how would you place this rise of nationalism? And more important, how would you see the role or the reaction architecture should have on this?
I think it's very easy. I mean, I think it's in the, I think I showed the slide with the shifting brackets from, you know, nation and world. I think it's the revenge of all those left behind, the simple nausea of the fact that, you know, since the political seems to become increasingly a subsector of the economy, the power of our leaders, however heroically they might posture, it only takes one election cycle to expose that as a folly. So I think it is a form of frustration and rebelliousness against that by definition, probably by mobilizing reflexes which in the long term are wholly counterproductive, but which in a way are understandable.
So is this a byproduct of or is it a medium through which the corporate ruled world functions, or is it something that architecture actively should engage with? Or
What do you mean, nationalism?
yes.
I wouldn't know how to.
Well, architecture has a long, very shady
Mhm.
history of.
Yeah, exactly. Which I just kind of prefer to steer clear of.
Yeah, that was exactly the
Right.
question. Should we? And,
What? Well, no, not.
or try to somehow.
Well, feel free if you're in the spirit of diversity. Feel free, but I mean, not for me. No.
But so there is no leading role for architecture anymore to steer away maybe from nationalism? Is there any role for architecture?
Well, I mean, I think the whole point of the lecture is that the whole notion of a leading role and the whole notion of a kind of heroism is a folly anyway, because I mean, architecture is far more a product of its contexts in multiple ways than it cares to admit.
I think that's an excellent place
All right. Okay.
in which to summarise. Thank you very much indeed, Roni. It's an excellent lecture. I got a lot from that. I have to say, halfway through, you answered one of my questions. I wrote down optimistic or pessimistic. In a way, it probably doesn't matter. I think it was both thinking and relevant. And I think you used the expression in answer to one of Patrick's points or questions, active agents. And I think we have to be active agents, not as a leader maybe in the modernist sense, but active agents as architects. So many, many thanks indeed again. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.